This is day 5 of the November-December 7-day 94 7-day retreat in Springwater. Something was brought up last night in a group meeting which had already been brought up 2 meetings earlier. We didn't go into it then last night. It also came more toward the end of the meeting. So we sort of had to cut off discussion of the topic. Several people already this morning told me how it worked in them, producing all kinds of feelings, energies, emotions. So we'll go into that this morning. I hope I can present it as accurate as possible, what the person was trying to say. And there are more meetings we can keep going on it, moving with it, clarifying. What was said was that even though questioning seems to be the work of this moment at Springwater, there's something that is not questioned at all, namely, what is the context in which this work is taking place? And not questioning that context thoroughly, bringing it up, looking at it together alone, constitutes a lack here. As an indication of context, it was mentioned that we're here in North America, 20th century, democracy, other things were mentioned to point to that context, which needs to be, or is felt, needed to be taken into consideration in total questioning. Or else something is awry, skewed, or ignored. As an example, was pointed out that the discussion which had started with questioning how to be with pain, physical pain, physiological pain, emotional, mental pain, being with it, or establishing conscious connections between what has happened in the past and is felt now. Talking about how pain is augmented by how we feel about our pain, our feeling that we should not have pain, or that we are diminished by having pain. All of this, which had been discussed, was mentioned as a partial approach to pain, the approach to pain would be quite different in an African tribe where the person who brought it up has lived for half a year or so. Completely different approach to pain. Pain is inflicted very heavily in puberty rites on both boys and girls, and there the attitude or approach is to endure it, to overcome individuality, attachment to the individual body, and become a member of the tribe, or one with the tribe, not the individual entity. So, what was pointed out is that there are greatly varying conditionings, attitude toward suffering and pain, which may be different from one country, one continent, one phase in history to another, one religious tradition to another. And that it behooves us, or would be helpful if we were aware of what particular cultural bias is programmed into us in our attitudes toward ourselves, the world, pain, everything. I have some feeling for what the person said, because starting quite early in life, as I have often reported, it's written in the introduction to the book, most people have read it, wondering about what is the meaning of life, and for a time entering university to study psychology, believing that with a psychology study more would be revealed, not just about myself, but the meaning of myself, relationship, and so forth. And I felt very quickly that psychology was not enough, so I studied sociology and anthropology at the same time, took a triple major, felt that these were all equally important, and was most fascinated, definitely most fascinated by anthropology, and was most helpful in studying what happens in different societies. This was in the 50s, the heyday of anthropology, Margaret Mead and her discoveries. Many others, I've forgotten so much about it, the data aren't at my fingertips anymore. But I remember such relief in seeing the total relativity of cultural values, cultural structures. Who is the head of the household? Who moves in with whom? Not just necessarily the woman with a man, but the other way around. Different religions, different economic systems. It was just fascinating to feel inwardly also a loosening up of strictures, what one had taken or not taken for granted, not even questioned. And it all being loosened, like plowing the soil, breaking it up in many clots so that air and light and rain can fall. After leaving college, not satisfied with the graduate work at that particular school, I studied on my own and found particular interest and fascination in liberating concepts and insights into that, in studying Joseph Campbell some 40 years before Bill Moyers. I read all of his books, and I don't know how many times I read them, to really make this my own, to understand it. And Heinrich Zimmer, on whose research a lot of Joseph Campbell's is based, and other people. I found it was much easier to study on my own, where I could read what I wanted to read. Didn't have to pass exams. And what was liberating in studying Joseph Campbell was the whole thing of the feminine, the relativity of how I was brought up, or how it was culturally determined. And I didn't grow up in North America, I come from Germany. My mother from Poland, Jewish heritage. So not everything here is North American. There are also people from different cultures here, from different continents. But I don't want to justify it or defend it, because it's an interesting question that concerned the person. So to see the relativity of whose gods or what gender god is reigning at the time, for the time being, in what culture, the male, the feminine, the Trinity, the multitude of gods and goddesses. This was all very, very interesting and breaking up rigidity, dogmatism. Not that I was raised in any dogmatic way, I was not. But a lot of stuff that we do take for granted. It's good to gain knowledge about the relativity of it. And maybe not just acquire knowledge. I seem to remember that in reading, in school and after school, I did not just try to remember, although that was a big part of it, but also look a little bit inwardly what was going on and what was established pattern. And yet that also did not prove satisfactory in trying to find what the meaning of being is, meaning of living. And the way led to mythology. Well, I've talked about mythology, and finding out about Buddhism made a lot of sense. To look into oneself, sit quietly, find out who one really is in quietness. So joining a Zen center, loving retreats, the quietness, although it was not very quiet there. But the possibility of finding out by oneself, and the opening up of the skull, if you will, the lightening, quieting down of the brain, so that there could be some clear seeing of what was going on in oneself. And then again discovering a discomfort with being locked into a system that I found myself justifying and defending, particularly if family and friends would ask what I was doing. And I could tell at the time I was trying to convince them, I was trying to convince myself. And it didn't quite work. It was something too much, because I've written and mentioned the aid of coming upon Krishnamurti, whose language I found much more accessible than the Japanese, Chinese, Indian language of Buddhism, of Buddhist writings. So there was some feeling for the context that enshrouded something that needed no enshrouding. And the context could be confusing, particularly if anyone here has studied koans, struggled with Chinese language. The tendency is to think that one can't solve this koan when it's too dense, but little by little, realizing there's also something cultural about a typically Chinese way of expressing things in enshrouded, mystical or foggy language, like the landscapes with fog and here and there something revealed. And that this was not just needing to clear the mind, but it was a difference of language that one had learned. Although in reading and hearing lots read in Teisho's talks about the Chinese monks struggling 10, 20, 30 years, they had as hard a time, even though they had the same language. A language which has no I in it, I understand. No I case, I am doing this. I'm walking across the street, but there's a different case, walking without the I. I wondered how come the Chinese had to labor so hard if they don't have that I in their language? There's something deeper, maybe, than our cultural conditioning. Maybe. We'll leave it open. So, finding Krishnamurti's language, Krishnamurti being raised in England, surrounded by English people after some 13, I don't know how many years of being in India. And he had an abhorrence of mystical stuff or traditional stuff. So there was really a clearing up of language, which I felt very helpful. Of course, his dialoguing with scientists, David Bohm, also helped a lot in making this language Western, accessible. And even though it came out of, what tradition does it come from? The tradition is still a shroud around what? That's also the fascinating thing, reading Meister Eckhart, the German Middle Ages, or writings from the Hindu past, reading Bhagavad Gita. It's different shrouds, different language, and sometimes a little bit of a different upkeep of the tradition. Eckhart, if he hadn't mentioned God in some way, he would have been put to death early. I think he was put to death. Not quite sure. But no matter what the tradition, the time, the context, there's something beyond all of that which is pointed at by those who understand that beyond and use usually not insufficient language, because language cannot express that which is not expressible in word, thought, and language. And yet, in reading different authors, past and present, it's a marvelous thing that what is pointed at is always the same, even though the coat is different. So need we understand our coats, our shells, our cocoons? Of course we do. This is how we live from moment to moment. A conditioned existence, conditioned by the present and the past, by our inheritance, our genes, a whole pool of inheritance, a pool of genes and DNA from which egg and sperm evolve and couple, and an organism develops. If prehistory and archaeology are correct, we all evolved from very few groups of people. So we all share the same genes and DNA and history. Which may not just all be located in the organism, in the physiology, in the brain, in the memory, but also, as some people are advancing today, in memory fields, which have no spatial separation. Rats learning a maze in England and taking 20, 30 runs to learn a maze. After that, rats in Australia, not related to the English rats at all by inheritance, learn that maze faster. This is only one of the experiments cited in support of a new theory that learning takes also place through fields of memory, form fields of memory, which know no spatial distance. And one more fascinating thing that came from studying Joseph Campbell in the 50s. He was really advocating the traveling of myths, not to believe so much in these independent creations of myth, but the travel that has taken place by land and sea, by human beings since the beginning almost, has carried these myths and symbols around so that we see similar evolution in different continents, different countries, linked to continents far away. So the question was, do we need to understand our shell? It's that which hinders us, which shackles us, which distorts our vision, makes impossible or narrows our perception of each other, of what goes on in ourselves. If I think I shouldn't have pain, that pain is not what I should feel, then it'll be felt differently than if I think I get attention and sympathy. I'll be a special person with pain. Or if I learn that I have to endure it, not to identify with this body, but then identify with a group, which is also conditioning. It's not the freedom from it, it's just a different variety, which I experienced in Germany. There was an attempt made to bring about a conditioning with the state. We had in our staircase in the school, even in a private school, which I attended at first, "You are nothing, your country is everything." Phrases like that were bombarded at these brains. The joy of putting one's life down for one's fatherland. In Germany it's fatherland, here it's motherland, isn't it? To achieve this, of course, for political ends, to achieve the subduing of individuality and the elevating of the state. With considerable success for a very brief time. I remember we were always told that Germany and Hitler's is the 1,000-year Reich. 1,000 years. How long did it last? 12? 12. Yeah. And yet when I come back to Germany, I still see, particularly in the older people, some of those characteristics of people that I grew up with. Not so much in the younger. They are much more like the young people here, which may have its source in television and computers, reaching across. Interesting to visit with my sister. We did it for 3.5 years. Yeah. Weeks. I mean months, I mean hours. I don't know what I mean. Coming back, of course I've been back all along, but at every time it's quite clear how American I have become and how Swiss she has become. She lives in Switzerland now. We both came from Germany. And yet underneath this new American clothing and her Swiss garb, what is there? That's why some people enjoy traveling. You travel and all of a sudden, particularly people who travel to Africa or India, realize what it is to be an American. Some people say it's a shock, a real shock to arrive in India. The difference and how it rattles, or the conditioning cannot feel any anchorage there. And yet one likes to be shaken up, at least some of us do, to bring to mind what is taken for granted. And at the same time, also discover how similar we are underneath these different crusts of different colors and shapes and forms. How similar we all are, and how else could it be? We're all born of parents, of sperm and egg uniting out of a common mass of genes. We're all take our birth through this narrow, dark channel. Most of us don't remember. Some claim they do. Maybe they do. We've all been nurtured for between 5, 6, 7, and 9 months in a pretty cozy environment. Not everyone. Some person told me she has brought up in memory training how her mother would pound her belly. She didn't want that baby. And we are through gliding or being pushed through that channel, which must be quite a painful thing, not just for the mother, but also for the baby, into a radically different environment, a radically different context, all of us coming out of the same context into a radically different one. Not so warm, not so moist, not food immediately flowing into the mouth upon demand. Not even demand, it just keeps flowing. I don't know how it is. I don't remember. We're all dwarfs among giants. We all grow up that way. No matter how short our parents may be, Lilliputites, they're still larger than we are. And of course, all of us subject to being bullied around. Maybe loved, maybe carried around. Recently we were in the Yoga Society giving a workshop. And the woman who was organizing and sort of tending to the workshop, she held her little 5-year-old boy in her arms all the time while she was selling a book or giving out pamphlets. And then she said, I have to fix supper now. It's my night for fixing supper for the community. There are some 9 or 10 people. That baby was in her arm. Our baby didn't grow up this way. I was told by everybody, including Dr. Spock, including what I remembered my mother telling me, that babies shouldn't be carried around all the time. It's not good for them. And I went against my better feelings. I would have loved to hold this baby all the time, but that wasn't what you did. You would spoil it or do something, create dependency, goodness knows what all the ideas are that float around from one generation to the next. And there are times, even with this mother, when the food doesn't come. She may go out sometime, or really she may have had it and she wants to take a day off. And then she's not there. So that's a common experience for all of us. At one point or another, the mother not being there, the food not coming instantly, and the moods that the baby's moods evokes in the mother and father. The hardest thing is a crying baby. One feels rejected. Because there may be different, when there's lots of time, and how many tribes are left where there's lots of time? But lots of time the baby is just taken care of. Although often the women work very hard and have it on the back, maybe in front. But somehow or other, all of us know fear from very early on. All of us, no matter what the context is, there's fear in human beings. Fear of separation. And the yearning back to unity, to being at one, not to be apart, not to be afraid. And the anger at not getting what one wants. Very early in little babies, little children, the free expression of that, and very often the suppression of it. It's hard to bear with an angry, tantrumy, stomping child. So these are just a few things mentioned that we share in common, including our defensiveness, either of ourselves or of our tribe. defensiveness and offensiveness, rivalry with others, other individuals or other tribes, other countries and nations, other ethnic groups, other religious groups. It's universal. And what we often talk about, I think we've talked about it in this retreat, the universality of tit for tat, paying back for injuries received, injuries paid back. These are very common psychological, sociological, anthropological mechanisms, have prevailed throughout history and are there today, watchable in each one of us. So how are we to become aware of conditioning? And does it matter whether it's private conditioning, personal, family conditioning, the street I grow up on conditioning, my class, my social class, my cultural group, my ethnic subgroup, my religious fold? It's all conditioning. How to be aware of it, and why be aware of it? It comes into awareness as the cause of suffering, of bondage. It happens because awareness happens on its own, regardless of cultural context. I don't know whether I saw a very moving 1-hour documentary in the last few weeks in television about a tribe in the Brazilian Amazon, the Arara, I think they were called. Maybe some of you saw it. Pushed around, decimated. Now they're protected for the time being. So they've grown to 150 again. But the felling of trees and the dredging of the river or the damming up, it happens all around them. So it's just a little island left of an amazing people, in which one of the main values is sharing, not getting something for yourself, but sharing with the others. And amazing democracy, if you will, or homogeneity, no different status for women or men. Just some wise old one who is the leader or who is the shaman who is asked for things. But a real playful equality, not just among the genders, but among the adults and the children. When the men came back from a very arduous hunting trip, they'd only eaten very little because most of it was to be shared with the rest of the people at home. The women, meanwhile, had prepared an alcoholic beverage by chewing a certain plant and spitting it with a tremendous aim into bottles. Like a spigot, it came out. And then when the feast was on, these bottles were handed around and everybody, including the little toddlers, drank. There was no prohibition, no drinking under 18. So, would someone in that group be interested in their conditioning? Feeling that I must wake up to my conditioning? I don't know. And I'm not so concerned about those others, because ultimately those others are also us. It's one evolving universe and human consciousness, which is not just a fine phrase, it is there to be experienced by each one of us. And needing to find out the source of one's being is a very widespread human urge, not just of the present day. in needing to find out one's source, what one is, the meaning of one's life, one comes head on, face to face with the conditioning. Whatever conditioning that may be. The personal, and at times the cultural, the ethnic. And in coming head on, is it cursed? Is it accepted? Is it rationalized? Or is it seen? And seeing is an entirely different thing from rationalizing it, knowing about it, explaining it, analyzing it. And the difference in these two ways is also not just theory, but is palpably experienceable by each one of us. The difference between seeing something directly and thinking about it. In which we're not saying thinking about it is bad, inferior, shouldn't happen, get rid of it, or I ought to see, or I ought to see all the time. This is what the brain contributes through its conditioning, such compulsions. And in watching one's moment-to-moment being, not attentive every moment, maybe in the beginning only attentive a few moments of the day, or longer times, it doesn't matter. One realizes the immense identification with this body-mind. Identification with the body, meaning the thought, this is me, this is what I am, this body, and maybe stronger even, I am this idea of myself, this story of my life. My imagery, not just one image, but a whole bundle of them constantly growing, some discarded, some new ones added, including the images of what I want to become, how I want to be seen as, and the attachment to that, the identification. Identification meaning the thought, this is what I am. And the question arising out of this is, can this identification and the attachment to it be seen? Can there be seeing of that and the idea that this is me, and seeing it without any acceptance or condemnation, with which I'm saying, and is up for investigation by each one who wants to investigate alone or together over one's whole lifetime. It's not a casual matter. It's possible to see the totality of conditioning at a glance. I don't mean all the different variegations and things. They unfold over time in a more attentive way of living. But to see identification with conditioning, identification with this body, with this story, can happen at a glance. And that seeing is not conditioned. That seeing has no context. What reveals itself is conditioning with its particular contexts. Is that difficult? Does that sound abstract? It may sound abstract, but it's offered for making it concrete, making it real by direct realization. yesterday or sometime, one person in a group meeting said there is, coming to retreat once or twice, there has been a freeing taking place in little bits and pieces. Seeing some pattern, and in the direct contact, it's an energy process. The seeing and the dissipation of what is seen. Forever, who knows? You have to see. It may come up again next moment, but it can be seen again. And it doesn't, I'm not saying you have to see the totality of conditioning, but completely seeing one its bit of conditioning is seeing conditioning as a whole. And it doesn't matter what the content is of what is seen. It doesn't matter. Whether it's the personal or the cultural, the social, the individual. It's conditioning and it's seeing. And when this seeing takes place, is there an urge for liberation? Which some people have talked about here, this yearning for liberation. Or is the seeing itself liberating? Insight into, let me carefully phrase it, into what we really are. Not just this conditioned body-mind. We will end here for today.